Lila Monroe stood at the towering iron gates of the Whitmore estate with her worn leather bag clutched tightly in her hand, her heart pounding like a quiet storm inside her chest. She had walked into many homes as a caregiver before, but none like this, none so hauntingly still, so suffocatingly grand, so frozen in time. The mansion loomed before her like a monument to pain, its sharp edges casting shadows that felt more like warnings than welcome. When the double doors creaked open, revealing a silent, uniformed butler who merely gestured for her to follow, she realized no one here would greet her with warmth. Her assignment was clear: bathe, feed, and manage the physical care of Jackson Whitmore, the young billionaire whose name once lit up the covers of Forbes and Fortune, now hidden from the world after a crash that left him paralyzed both in body and spirit. The contract had been precise. No questions, no conversation unless initiated, and under no circumstances should she blur professional lines. Emotions were not just discouraged, they were forbidden. But from the moment she entered the sterile room where he lay, Lila felt the contract tighten around her heart like a chain. Jackson didn't turn his head when she entered. He didn't flinch when she gently pressed a damp towel to his skin. He lay there with eyes open but vacant, a man breathing yet utterly lifeless, trapped not just in a broken body, but in the ruins of something invisible. Lila had seen pain before, but this was different. It wasn't just injury, it was erosion. His silence wasn't quiet, it screamed. Still, she didn't retreat. She set her routines gently, bathing him with warm cloths scented with lavender, humming soft lullabies from her childhood, opening the windows just enough to let in air, but not the noise. Every day she arrived, and every day he remained mute, his ocean blue eyes cold, unreadable, but never unwatching. She caught him once, barely, when she thought he was asleep. His gaze flickered toward her as she gently brushed his fingers clean, as if trying to remember the feeling of human connection. That night, she cried in the guest room they had given her. Not because of the silence, but because she could feel how much it hurt him to keep it. She learned to read his body like a language. The way his jaw clenched when his brother's name was mentioned on the news, the way his fingers twitched when her humming drifted to a certain melody. Slowly, without words, he began to respond. He blinked twice when she asked if the water was too hot, let his eyes linger when she spoke softly about her day. There were days he stared blankly at the ceiling while she worked, and others when he seemed to follow her with invisible threads. The mansion, though still cold, began to shift. The staff watched her with wary curiosity, unused to someone treating their employer like a man rather than a patient. But Lila didn't care about the rumors that whispered through the halls. She was here for him, even if he never asked her to be. What she didn't expect was how much she would ache for him to speak, not just for his sake, but for hers. She wanted to hear his story, to know what cracked him, what carved such deep grief into his silence. But every time she was tempted to ask, she remembered the contract, the clause that reminded her she wasn't here to feel. Yet how could she not, when his pain seeped into her bones like winter air? Then, one late evening, as she wiped down his arms, her hand paused just a second longer than usual. He turned his head, slowly, like it cost him everything, and looked directly at her. For the first time, their eyes locked. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was charged, heavy, profound. In that moment, she understood. He wasn't refusing to speak. Because he couldn't. He was choosing not to, because the world had broken him, betrayed him, left him to rot in this palace of marble and secrets. And she? She had walked in like a candle, fragile but lit. She swallowed her emotions, forced a professional smile, and turned away. But something had changed. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Sometimes the silence between two souls speaks louder than 1,000 words." She didn't know it yet. But that silence was the start of something neither of them could control. Something far more dangerous than love. Healing. Because the moment she stepped into his world, the contract of silence had already been broken. Not by her words, but by her heart. The air the next morning felt heavier, as though the house itself had begun to exhale secrets Lila was never meant to hear, but now couldn't ignore. Jackson's gaze had locked with hers the night before, and something intangible had shifted, like a thread pulled gently from a tightly woven knot. His silence didn't return to its previous coldness, but it lingered, this time with weight and meaning. Yet as she moved through the mansion's silent corridors, Lila couldn't shake the creeping feeling that eyes followed her wherever she went. Not Jackson's, but ones that peered through shadows and cracked doors. The staff, always stiff and formal, had begun to murmur when she passed, quickly silencing themselves when she looked their way. But it wasn't paranoia, she could feel it. Something was wrong, festering in the corners of this marble castle. Jackson flinched every time the door opened unexpectedly, his fists tensing, shoulders stiffening, subtle but unmistakable signs of a man expecting harm. One evening, while tidying the drawers in his private study, Lila's fingers brushed against something stuck behind the bottom panel. Curiosity overcame caution, and she slid the wood back, revealing a bundle of half-burned letters, singed at the corners, their ink blurred by fire and tears. Names she didn't recognize surfaced in looping cursive of Elena, Damien, and repeated mentions of betrayal. There were photographs, too, one of Jackson smiling with a woman whose beauty was ethereal, her hand resting on his heart, a golden locket dangling from her neck. The back read, "Forever, until he takes it all." And then there were the newspapers. Headlines that once praised Jackson's success now screamed suspicion. Whitmore heir crashes amidst scandal. One article, nearly torn in half, claimed insiders believed the brakes were tampered with, and a blurry image captured Damien near the wreck. Lila's breath caught. Was this why he never spoke? Why he hid behind his silence like armor? The truth was here, buried in scorched memories and printed lies. That evening, as rain slashed against the windows and thunder echoed through the vast estate, Jackson whispered something for the first time since her arrival. His lips barely moved, but the sound was unmistakable. Lila. Her name had never sounded more sacred. It was the first word he chose to speak, and in that fragile syllable, years of pain unraveled. She blinked back tears, knowing this wasn't affection. It was trust, raw and rare. From that night onward, he began accepting her help in ways he had once refused. When she offered to help him sit upright, he didn't resist. When she guided his feet to the ground, he didn't look away. Each step was a battle, but together, they won inches of progress that felt like miles. Yet the closer they became, the darker the house seemed to grow. Lights flickered more often. Footsteps echoed behind closed doors. And one stormy night, as Lila passed the west wing, normally sealed and silent, she heard voices not meant for her ears. The door was slightly ajar, and within she saw Damien Whitmore, handsome and venomous, speaking into a phone with the poise of a man used to power. "It's almost done," he muttered. "Once the board declares him entirely unfit, the rest is mine. He's still weak. And that nurse? A distraction." Lila covered her mouth, stepping back, her heart thundering louder than the rain outside. So it was true. Jackson wasn't just abandoned, he was being hunted by his own blood. She returned to her room shaken, every part of her trembling with fury and fear. The man she had grown to care for wasn't paranoid. He was targeted. And now she was too. She sat beside Jackson that night without speaking of what she'd heard, only taking his hand and squeezing it gently. He didn't flinch this time. In fact, he squeezed back. And though the silence held 1,000 unspoken truths, her heart whispered one undeniable promise. She wouldn't let him fall alone, not while she could still stand beside him. As she helped him lie back, brushing his damp hair away from his eyes, she murmured, "You don't just bathe the body when you care for someone. You wash away their pain, one scar at a time." His eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with something close to recognition. The mansion may have been built of secrets and betrayal, but for the first time, a crack had appeared in its foundation, and from it, something pure had begun to bloom. The following morning unfolded beneath a thin veil of mist, as if the world itself was holding its breath, afraid to disturb the fragile space that now existed between Lila and Jackson, a space carved not by words but by something deeper, quieter, and far more powerful. He no longer turned away when she entered the room. In fact, his eyes sought hers first, hesitant yet hopeful, like a man lost in darkness who'd finally glimpsed the edge of light. His voice, still gravelly from disuse, broke the silence as he looked at her with a storm behind his eyes and whispered the truth that had caged him for so long. Damien, his own brother, had stolen millions from the company, forged signatures, rerouted accounts, and when Jackson discovered it, he didn't just confront him. He trusted him, gave him a chance to come clean. The accident, Jackson murmured, wasn't an accident at all. His brakes had been tampered with. The crash had been deliberate. But with no surveillance footage, no solid paper trail, and the family name shielding Damien from scrutiny, Jackson's silence had become both his prison and his punishment. Lila sat beside him, her hands cold but steady, absorbing every word, her chest tightening with each truth like thorns winding around her lungs. She didn't interrupt. She didn't gasp. She simply listened, letting his pain pour freely for the first time in what felt like forever. And when he finished, when his voice cracked into nothingness, she pressed her palm against his and whispered, "Then we find your strength again, not for revenge, but for freedom." From that day forward, their routine transformed. Gone were the motions of a caregiver and patient. In their place grew something sacred. She began teaching him how to shift his weight, how to stand for seconds at a time, how to rebuild muscles that had forgotten what movement felt like. In the privacy of his sunroom, where light poured in like grace, she guided him step by trembling step across a floor he never thought he'd feel beneath his feet again. She coached his voice through short, steady sentences, encouraged him to write what he couldn't say. At first shaky letters on lined paper, then full sentences, raw and powerful, bleeding emotion he could no longer bottle. But as the days stretched into nights, something unspoken began to blossom. It was in the way his fingers lingered on hers when she passed him the pen, in how he watched her laugh as if it were the rarest sound on earth, in how she found herself leaning in too close, staying too long, aching to tell him everything, even the one thing that could shatter it all, because beneath her soft words and tender touch, Lila carried a truth she never meant to bring into this house. She was the daughter of Marissa Monroe, the woman Jackson once loved and lost in the most devastating way. A woman who vanished without explanation, leaving behind only rumors and silence. Lila had grown up watching her mother cry over someone she never named, connecting the dots only years later. When the Whitmore family posted a private nurse opportunity, Lila knew exactly who the patient was. She didn't come for revenge or closure. She came because some part of her needed to see him, to understand what had broken her mother's heart so completely. But now, living beside him, touching him, feeling her heartbeat echo in sync with his, she found herself trapped between truth and tenderness. She had told herself she wouldn't fall. She was just here to help. But how could she remain untouched when the man before her, broken yet beautiful, started trusting her in ways that went beyond therapy? His smiles, though rare, were now only for her. His hand, once clenched and distant, reached for hers in silence when nightmares returned. There was no denying it. Lila was falling in love with Jackson Whitmore, and the weight of her secret grew heavier with each shared breath. She'd lay awake at night wondering what would happen if he ever found out. If he'd see her as an echo of his past, or as the woman who helped him reclaim his future. Yet no matter how she tried to guard herself, her heart continued to betray her, swelling with warmth every time he whispered her name, trembling every time his eyes softened at the sight of her. And Jackson, too, began to change, not just in body, but in spirit. He laughed one afternoon when she spilled tea on his lap, shaking his head like a man remembering joy. He joked about her awful singing, scrawling, "Please stop the torture" in shaky handwriting, then winking when she pouted. But beneath every soft moment, deeper currents stirred, of desire, of need, of something they were both too afraid to name. And Lila, helplessly entangled in the very emotions she'd sworn to avoid, finally realized that she wasn't healing him alone. He was healing her, too. Because the wounds her mother left, the abandonment, the cold silences, the fear of not being enough, were slowly mending every time Jackson looked at her like she mattered. But the truth still sat in her chest like a ticking clock. One day it would come out. One day he would learn. And when he did, Lila knew she would either be the woman who saved him, or the reason he broke all over again. For now, she chose silence, not out of deceit, but out of desperation to hold on to the one thing she never expected to find in the walls of that haunted mansion: love. Because sometimes, the heart doesn't care for logic. It only listens to the silent screams of love. Just when the warmth between them began to feel like home, when Lila's presence had become more essential to Jackson than the air he breathed, the cruel irony of fate unveiled its most merciless card: truth. The walls of trust they had so painstakingly built were raised in moments when Jackson, trembling but resolute, opened the envelope delivered by his private investigator. Inside were photographs, timelines, old records, proof that the girl who had been feeding him, clothing him, speaking love through her eyes, was the daughter of the one who had once shattered him beyond recognition. His hands shook, not from physical weakness, but from betrayal laced with disbelief. How many nights had she watched him, knowing her mother once walked away as if he were disposable? Had she touched him with pity? Or worse, had she planned this from the beginning? A setup? Revenge cloaked in affection? Lila burst into the study moments later, perhaps sensing the storm, but her words evaporated as she met the fire in his eyes. Fire not of hatred, but deep, gutted sorrow. "You were just a pawn," he rasped, the words slicing his own throat as much as they did hers. "Like your mother." The pain in her eyes was instant and searing, but she didn't run. She stood rooted, as if the truth had snapped her heart, but not her soul. "No," she whispered, voice trembling like a leaf in winter. "I was never a pawn. I was your anchor." But the bitterness in his chest, too overwhelming, rejected her calm. He stepped forward and with one brutal motion pushed her away, not violently, but enough to tell her she didn't belong anymore. She stumbled back, stunned more by the emotional rupture than the physical force. That night, the air in the mansion changed. Where once there had been piano notes and candlelight and hope, now lived silence that echoed like grief. Jackson retreated into himself, refusing food, declining therapy, staring out windows as if looking for answers in the dark clouds. The staff tiptoed around him, as though any wrong movement would shatter what little of him remained. Lila, however, didn't linger. She packed her few things with a quiet dignity, her hands brushing the fabric of memories, her eyes hollow yet unwavering. Before leaving, she paused outside his door, the one she once pushed open each morning with a soft good morning and a tray of sunlight. Now she stood on the other side of a barricade he had built with pain. She rested her forehead against the wood, closed her eyes, and in a voice so soft it could have been mistaken for a dream, she said, "Even broken hearts beat, Jackson. Yours will find its rhythm again, with or without me." Then she turned, not looking back, every step down the marble hallway echoing like a farewell symphony. Jackson, hidden behind that door, didn't breathe for what felt like a century. His hands clenched the arms of his chair, knuckles white, lips parted but silent. He had so much to say, so many questions. So much anger, but beneath it all, an ache so deep it felt like bleeding from the soul. He didn't call out, he didn't chase her, he simply watched from the window as her silhouette vanished through the iron gates, swallowed by the mist of a world that never forgave soft hearts. And in that void she left behind, he realized something terrifying. That he had pushed away the only person who'd ever stayed, not because she had to, but because she chose to. And now, the silence roared louder than pain, louder than memory, louder than love. The door had barely closed behind her, yet its echo haunted Jackson like a slow-burning wound that refused to heal. Days blurred into nights as silence became the loudest voice in the mansion, whispering regrets he couldn't silence. Though his body healed, muscles rebuilding, strength returning, his heart remained paralyzed in a place only she could reach. He practiced walking without assistance, standing in front of mirrors, rehearsing strength like a soldier preparing for war, but every movement reminded him of the woman who once held his hands through the pain. Then came the call, Damien's voice like a poison-laced invitation, demanding he attend the upcoming press event, framing it as a celebration of recovery. But Jackson knew it was a trap cloaked in flashing cameras and staged sympathy. On the day of the event, he stood tall in a tailored suit, but behind his eyes was a storm no one could see. Flashes exploded from all directions, journalists fired intrusive questions, and fake smiles circled him like vultures. And then, just as he thought he couldn't breathe, she appeared. Lila. Not in scrubs, not with a clipboard, but as a vision draped in crimson silk, her hair cascading like a waterfall of memories he once tried to drown. The moment her eyes locked with his, time folded in on itself. She didn't speak at first. She simply walked through the sea of strangers and placed his trembling hand against her heart, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Still beats for you." And in that instant, everything he thought he knew unraveled. The shame, the betrayal, the anger, it all melted beneath the truth in her eyes. He nodded silently, unable to speak through the lump in his throat, then slipped away from the crowd, and somehow she followed without a word. The garden outside shimmered in moonlight and fairy lights, as if the universe had prepared this stage just for them. A quartet played soft, aching strings nearby, and for the first time since his injury, he reached for her hand, not out of weakness, but need. She accepted without hesitation, and there, beneath the blooming jasmine and the soft hush of the night, Jackson led her into a quiet dance. His steps were unsure at first, but her presence steadied him more than any cane or therapist ever had. "I was dead inside," he murmured, his voice cracking with buried pain. "Until your love brought me back." She closed her eyes, and their foreheads touched, the warmth between them dissolving every barrier they once built. Then came the kiss. Not a desperate, fiery collision, but something slower, deeper. A kiss of forgiveness and scars, of stitched hearts and untold dreams. Her lips trembled against his like a quiet promise. He tasted regret, but also redemption. Their hands clung to each other, not for balance, but as if letting go would mean the end of something irreplaceable. The night held its breath, and though no cameras captured it, though the world moved on unaware, something sacred happened in that sliver of time, the kind of moment that carves itself into souls, not headlines. When they parted, he didn't speak, and neither did she. Words weren't needed anymore. Everything that had shattered between them now stood mended, Not perfectly, but beautifully imperfect. And as they stood there, wrapped in moonlight and second chances, silence no longer meant distance. It meant understanding. It me. And love finally finding a voice. The moment Jackson stepped out of the boardroom, disowning Damien and reclaiming everything he had lost, he felt something deeper than victory. It was peace, a peace that had eluded him for years, now blooming in the presence of Lila, who stood beside him not as someone who entered his life by chance, but as someone meant to awaken it. And from that moment on, he vowed never to let the pain of his past define his future again. The sprawling Whitmore mansion, once a symbol of greed, betrayal, and emotional imprisonment, stood silent behind them, a haunted monument to all that had broken him. But Jackson refused to let it remain a tombstone of his trauma. With unwavering resolve and Lila's calming strength by his side, he poured his heart, energy, and wealth into transforming the mansion into something new, a place where no one would be judged by their scars, where no one would ever be silenced by their suffering again. He named it the Lila Foundation, not just in honor of the woman who saved him, but as a declaration to the world that love, in its purest form, does not pity or possess, it heals. The empty halls that once echoed with cold footsteps were now filled with laughter, group therapy sessions, the hush of safe conversations, and the rustle of journals being filled by hands that had once trembled. The sterile marble floors were replaced with warm wood and soft rugs. Portraits of pain were replaced with paintings of hope. Survivors of abuse, trauma, abandonment, young and old, came through the doors seeking more than help. They came seeking themselves. And Jackson met them not as a millionaire or founder, but as one of them. A man who had shattered and been glued back together, not perfectly, but beautifully. Meanwhile, Lila, ever gentle yet fierce, worked alongside him. Not behind the scenes, but at the forefront, hosting sessions, speed arm, king publicly, and designing programs that prioritized dignity over charity. Their love no longer needed words to prove itself. It breathed in every flower they planted in the once-dead garden, in every child's hand they held, in every frightened soul they made feel seen. And it was there, in that same garden where everything had once begun, where Jackson, now whole in spirit, led Lila under a sky dusted with gold and indigo, where lanterns floated above and wind chimes sang in whispers. It was the same spot where Lila had once simply touched his hand, back when he couldn't even speak, couldn't even cry. That touch had started a fire in his soul, a gentle burn that melted through years of numbness. Now, dressed in a soft gray suit, no longer the shell of a man he once was, Jackson looked at her, not with desperation but with clarity. He dropped to one knee, not out of custom, but reverence. Not because he needed saving, but because he had already been saved. He took her hands in his, pressed them to his heart, and let his voice tremble, not from fear, but truth. "You bathed my body," he whispered, "but you cleansed my soul. You held me when I couldn't hold myself. You taught me that love isn't fixing someone, it's sitting with them while they break. Will you marry me, Lila Monroe? Not to complete me, but to walk beside me in the life we're building?" Lila stood frozen for only a heartbeat, her lips trembling, not because she doubted, but because the gravity of his words hit something sacred in her chest. Her tears spilled freely, but they were not from sorrow. They were from release. From the memory of a man she'd once seen barely breathing, now offering her a lifetime. She knelt with him, forehead to forehead, hands over his chest, and said through a voice filled with joy, awe, and deep understanding, "Yes." And in that instant, the wind blew through the garden like an exhale from heaven, and time stood still, not for the world, but for two souls who had finally found home in each other.